The debt service suspension initiative that I mentioned a moment ago ran out 2 weeks ago. It will not apparently be renewed. That means that those 46 countries that have avoided the need to consider a full-scale debt restructuring because they had a suspension of their bilateral government debt commitments for the last 19 months are now going to have to reconsider their position. If in 2022 we see a renewal of sovereign debt problems, what will it look like? For the poorest countries, the good news is that the G20, tailing or eliminating the debt service suspension initiative, have replaced it with something they call the Common Framework. This is a program in which eligible countries, it's the same 73 eligible countries, they are the poorest countries, are eligible to approach their bilateral, their government creditors in a way that has not been possible before. To date, bilateral creditors, traditional bilateral creditors, the OECD countries, the richer countries, had renegotiated their loans to emerging market countries jointly under the auspices of something called the Paris Club. This just sits at the Ministry of Finance in Paris, and that's why it's called the Paris Club. The problem that has developed over the last 10 years is that the proportion of bilateral lending represented by the traditional Paris Club countries has been declining, and non-Paris Club countries like China, like India, like South Africa have vastly increased the amount of their lending. And so until the Common Framework was announced, and it was announced in November of 2020, a debtor country would have to negotiate with its Paris Club creditors and then separately negotiate with its non-Paris Club creditors such as China, and then separately negotiate with its commercial creditors. The Common Framework says that non-traditional Paris Club creditors and non-traditional, including China, will sit at the same table and will negotiate jointly, and this is thought to be a considerable advance in the architecture for sovereign debt workouts. To date, 3 countries have sought Common Framework debt restructurings: Chad, Ethiopia, and Zambia. Regrettably, none of them have yet reached the point of striking a deal with their Common Framework creditor committees. An issue, an important issue that will affect any country seeking a Common Framework debt restructuring is a requirement of the Common Framework that whatever debt relief is agreed by the bilateral creditors, the net present value of that debt relief must be sought from commercial creditors. So commercial creditors will be expected to provide comparable, that's their term of art, debt relief to the sovereign debtor. We will see how easily commercial creditors accept that requirement. It has been a requirement of Paris Club debt restructurings for decades, but frankly, its implementation in practice has been spotty. The restructuring of private sector debts, which is the issue that perhaps most concerns the investor community, may be more complicated in this decade than it has been in the past for a number of reasons. First, there is a much greater diversity in the creditor universe, private creditor universe for many countries. Traditionally, the private sector lenders were either commercial banks lending through syndicated bank loans, or in this century, bondholders. We've now seen a number of instances in which there are many more types of creditors, unpaid suppliers, derivatives holders, and a whole host of others. We have no mechanism in the sovereign debt restructuring business for coordinating such a disparate group of creditors, and that is going to be a challenge. There also is a greater diversity in the instruments. They are no longer just syndicated bank loans or bonds. There's a whole variety of instruments. An increasingly significant issue, and one likely to pose significant problems for commercial or restructuring of commercial debt in this decade, is the presence of secured lending arrangements. That is, arrangements in which the sovereign debtor has either directly or structurally provided collateral for the loan. That makes it much more difficult to restructure a loan that benefits from that kind of collateral, because for obvious reasons, the lender is reluctant to give up the benefit of his collateral. An additional reason is that starting with the financial crisis in 2008, a number of countries have effectively borrowed, but under arrangements in which their liability for the debt is contingent. So, for example, classic case, they would allow a state-owned enterprise to borrow under cover of a guarantee by the sovereign. Normally, they can keep that contingent liability off of their balance sheets. And it's not at all clear that the credit rating agencies, even the IMF, know the extent of these contingent liabilities. If the country faces a debt crisis, something will have to be done with those contingent liabilities. And again, we do not, in the sovereign debt community, have a particularly good solution to that. Finally, I think there will be a greater temptation on the part of commercial creditors to decline participation in sovereign debt workouts, in part because of how the Argentine saga ended. Argentina defaulted in 2001. The crisis that triggered was not actually ended until 2016, 15 years later. And the creditors that had declined to participate in the Argentine debt restructuring, there were a limited number of them, but they had large claims, wound up getting very significant payouts. And that has left a memory in the mind of the market, and I think may tempt a number of investors to decide that they will walk that path in a future a future sovereign debt crisis in a particular country. Conclusion, my conclusion, I am cautiously pessimistic about the state of the global debt market as we go into this year and further into this decade. My pessimism is tempered by the fact that we live in an extraordinarily volatile period. It could be that central banks, perhaps under political pressure, reverse their monetary tightening and return to a more accommodative stance. That is possible. It is possible that growth could exceed current expectations. There was a spurt of growth as we appeared to be coming out of the pandemic, but the IMF and the World Bank are now projecting much lower rates of growth in 2022, 2023, but they could be wrong. The COVID battle could be won this year. We thought we were going to win it last year with the vaccines, but who knows? Perhaps it could be won. And maybe if the central banks continue with their monetary tightening, they can thread the proverbial needle and do it in a way that does not engender a recession in the developed countries. But all of that would assume a state of benignity in the financial world, in the political world, in the natural world, that I think we would be foolish to assume will exist. And therefore, while my pessimism is tempered by the fact that unexpected things happen, I remain cautiously pessimistic. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that was Professor Lee Buchheit for you. And there he was, enriching us all with his profound insights and, of course, sharing with us from his experience and expertise his perspective on the global debt outlook. So on that thought-provoking note, ladies and gentlemen, it's now time for us to take this evening's discussion forward. And we now move on to a very valuable part of our agenda today, which is, of course, the panel discussion. As you can see, we have the stage all set to bring on our experts as well as our thought leaders on the topic, Sri Lanka Economic Outlook 2022. And as we look forward to hearing from their esteemed viewpoints, ladies and gentlemen, may I now introduce to you each of our panelists here this evening. We'd like to get started by introducing Professor H.D. Karunaratne. Professor Karunaratne is a well-known business economist, academic, author, and the director of the Institute of Human Resource Advancement. Professor Karunaratne is currently the coordinator of the Doctor of Business Administration program at the University of Colombo. He's also chairman of the Governing Council at the Institute of Policy Studies, Sri Lanka. Since October 2014, Professor Karunaratne has been vice president of the Sri Lanka Economic Association. And in very recent news, Professor Karunaratne has been appointed as the Vice Chancellor of the University of Colombo, effective from April this year. Ladies and gentlemen, let's now welcome on stage Professor H.D. Karunaratne. I'd now like to introduce to you our second panelist, Kasuri Chella Wilson. Kasuri Chella Wilson is the first female CEO of a public quoted conglomerate in Sri Lanka, namely Hema's Holdings PLC. She's also one of the most prominent corporate leaders in the country. A fellow of the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants and an alumna of the Executive Leadership Program at Harvard Business School, Kasuri has been recognized as being one of the 12 top women changemakers in the country by the Parliament of Sri Lanka and USAID. Kasuri was awarded the Woman Superachiever Award at the World Women Leadership Congress Awards in India, and she's also the recipient of the Career Role Model Award by Women in Management Sri Lanka and the IFS, a World Bank group. With that introduction, let's now welcome Kasuri Chella Wilson. And our final panelist who will be joining us on stage is Deshal Dimel. Deshal is an economist who has experience across government, private sector, and academia. He served as economic advisor to the Ministry of Finance of Sri Lanka, working on tax reforms and other public finance matters. He was also a member of the National Trade Negotiation Committee, where he led negotiations on trade in services, completing Sri Lanka's first bilateral trade and services agreement with Singapore. Deshal has previously worked in the corporate sector as senior economist at the Haley's Group. He has a degree in philosophy, political science, and economics from the University of Oxford, and a master's in international political economy from the London School of Economics. Deshal was also recognized by the World Economic Forum as a young global leader in 2019. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Deshal Dimel. Of course, our fourth panelist will be joining us virtually, and that is our keynote speaker, Professor Lee Buchheit. And he's, of course, already been introduced to the gathering, so we warmly welcome Professor Lee to join in the discussion as well. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, let me now introduce to you our moderator for the discussion. She is a policy research analyst at Advocata Institute. Let's put our hands together for Satya Karnaratna. And with that, we are all set now for an engaging conversation on Sri Lanka Economic Outlook 2022. I now hand over control to Satya as she takes the conversation ahead.
Good evening to all of you. Thank you very much for being present here today. Even though we are only 13 days into a brand new year, I think all of us are rather concerned about the trajectory of the country's economy and what new challenges the year 2022 would bring. The country's debt issue, foreign exchange crisis is being severely felt as we speak. People are struggling in long queues to be able to access cooking gas, kerosene. There's a shortage of milk powder. The cost of living is increasing unbearably. And also power shortages seem to be more frequent than usual. So I think it's quite safe to conclude that the year 2022 is off to a rather rocky start, and I think all of you might agree with me when I say that. Keeping this in mind, the Friedrich Naumann Foundation has invited 4 esteemed panelists who are experts and are well known in their respective fields to speak of what lies ahead in terms of the economy for the year 2022, and most importantly, what policies the government can explore to rectify this trajectory the country's economy is on at the moment. Before we dive into the conversation in deep, I'd like to remind our distinguished panelists that you would be given a time duration of 5 minutes to answer each question. And for everyone who's joining with us online, you are given the opportunity to direct us your questions via the comment section of your respective social media platform. You can also use Slido to do so, the password to which you can see online as we speak. Without further ado, I'd like to move on to our first question. My first question goes to Professor H.D. Karunaratne. Before we move into the conversation, Professor, congratulations on your new appointment as the Vice Chancellor of the University of Colombo. As I stated earlier, Professor, it's no doubt that the general public is indeed bearing the brunt of the larger macroeconomic challenges of the country at the moment. In difficult times such as this, Professor, it is usual for people to look to the government for solutions and for some relief. Moving into the year 2022 or progressing into the year 2022, Professor, what can the people expect from the government, or rather what should the people expect from the government?
Very good evening to all. Thank you very much for inviting me. Of course, we need to first and most importantly understand economics is science when we get data. If you don't have data, it's not science. So the important thing, in Sri Lankan context, are we thinking rationally is very important. The issues today, what we are facing, gradually developed within 70 years. It is not overnight, and according to the current situation, of course we know, we all are in an economic crisis, but the issue is that I have doubt whether we can take a short-term policy to overcome this, because this is a long-term issue. We know that particularly since 1978, the Sri Lanka gradually faced the trade deficit and balance of payment problem, and now it is converted to debt problem. So every year about 3 to 4 billion US dollars we had to borrow from various countries and donor agencies. So the accumulated debt stock is very large today. And what I believe that we do not have agreement about what kind of policies we are adopting. I think it is not today, but long-term impact, because, Sri Lanka is always having dream. We know that Sri Lanka is a special developing country. The issue in Sri Lanka, we have dreams, but we are not working practically to achieve those dreams. So what I see that the widening budget deficit, widening trade deficit, which are inherited during last 30 years, 30, 40 years. And meanwhile, we faced the pandemic. During the pandemic, we lost the normal earnings like tourism, 4 billion, or maybe remittances, then aggravated the debt issue. Meanwhile, we know that we had to spend money to vaccination and giving subsidies for people because of the economic crisis. So therefore, I think we have to come out from the dream policies, because majority of Sri Lankans believe that the foreign investment will resolve all the problems in the country. But the issue is that to what extent we have political parties agreed to go for a kind of foreign direct investment. Are we ready to give our lands? Are we ready to invite foreigners to use our resources? I don't think the political parties have agreement. Without coming into any agreement with the foreign countries or foreign investors, any party coming, the opposition party is opposing. So the foreign investment normal pattern doesn't work in Sri Lankan context. That is one thing. And though we talk about the Sri Lankan economy, we do not have information. That is the number one. Even today, we do not have information, grassroots level information. We do not have, so without having information, we cannot mobilize the economy. One can say that if we take the finance minister or the government, we will do this. But the issue, are we going for further loans? Are we going for dream foreign investment without changing any policy and assuring that our resources will govern by ourselves? There are a lot of issues in this line. So therefore, what I want to emphasize that we should first think how we concern about these issues. Of course, that 2022 is not so easy year. I think I can remember where the Sri Lanka is well famous on actually among the developing countries also by saying that Ceylon has eaten the fruit before the cultivation. So always we go for easy policies without sacrificing anything from our side. So therefore we try to get the foreign currency and satisfy the needs of ordinary people. So this subsidy culture we need to address, particularly public sector organizations where we have about 1.4 million working in public sector. All the time we are increasing their salaries without even at least one request to improve their productivity. And there are a large number of loss-making institutions. So keeping these loss-making institutions, we are trying to get the loans from other countries. So how do we run this as a rational economy? Because our economic activities are irrational. And on the other hand, we believe that we can develop our entrepreneurial culture, but still how many new businesses are generated even in a normal situation in Sri Lankan context. So you know that number of entrepreneurs are less than 2.8% of our population. So how the country can develop without having businesses, without having entrepreneurs? If you go to developed country, at least 20% of people are business owners. So without inculcating entrepreneurship, we can't go for development. Maybe short run, one can say, of course, we will go for debt negotiation and we will postpone the payment of debt until we go for this kind of permanent solutions. When we talk about economics, one important aspect I will let you know, all the developed countries, they have the economic measure called input-output table, where the inputs coming, where the output going. And in Sri Lankan context, we do not create an input-output table. So we do not know where the resources coming, who are getting what kind of subsidies, what kind of money we are wasting. So I think you can understand what I am saying. It's a long-term issue and we need to get together and think a permanent solution as economists to the current solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. I think that's a very valid point you bring out about whether rewarding policies are as easy to implement. Moving on to Deshal, as a well-known figure in the field of research and policy and even in the private sector, how do you view Sri Lanka's economy at the moment, more precisely the country's debt sustainability? And do you think the year 2022 presents an opportunity for economic recovery?
Great. Thanks Satya, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak today. So I think when you look at 2022, the elephant in the room is what Professor Buchheit outlined in terms of Sri Lanka's debt sustainability and the approach that we take to managing external debt payments this year and of course going forward. If you look at the existing balances that we have gross official reserves of about $3.1 billion, of which $1.5 billion is a yuan denominated swap. So you have effectively usable reserves of about 1.5 billion. Add to that the $400 million that the RBI swap is likely to bring in this month. So around $1.9 billion worth of usable reserves. But we also have payments, liabilities that mature during the course of 2022 of around $6.9 billion. So the gap between these two, the liabilities and the existing reserves, is quite dramatic. And even with any potential inflows that the country may receive in the coming months, it will be very difficult to prevent reserves from going down to zero without continuing these very drastic measures to control imports and to control all of the outflows. So what we're doing is effectively by restricting imports, by restricting any external payments, there's a lot of pain that's being imposed upon the domestic economy. Now that applies from the consumer who is finding it difficult to obtain some essential commodities, but also to businesses in terms of being able to access raw materials on time and in terms of a regular supply. So there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of challenges that are caused to business in this environment. So the issue that we face in 2022 is that either of the paths that we have before us. So we can either continue to try to muddle through getting swaps from a certain party, a bilateral transaction from another party. We can continue to try to do that, but we still have to continue with restrictive import measures. Or the alternative is to enter into negotiations with creditors and restructure our debt. Both options are not pain-free options. So if you look at the second option with regard to a debt restructuring, that would also, of course, entail significant reforms that will be required on the fiscal side. There's likely to be requirements. So the creditors are likely to expect an IMF program to underpin a restructuring agreement. IMF programs, we all know, will also be associated with revenue-raising measures, controls over public expenditure, measures to ensure that interest rates and exchange rates work more in line with market forces, all of which will create headwinds for growth and for economic activity. So either option comes with its own challenges and comes with its own costs. What Sri Lanka needs to do is to make a call as to what makes sense from a longer term perspective and pursue that in earnest. I think we can talk about that those choices as we go down the road. But the point is that in whatever path Sri Lanka chooses this year, it's going to be a path that creates significant headwinds for growth and economic activity. That said, there's a saying that never waste a good crisis, right? So sometimes you require a crisis of this nature to really take those bold steps and those big reforms that Professor Karunaratne alluded to as well. Sri Lanka does need to make significant changes in the way that we manage our public finances, in the way that we manage our trade, in the way that we manage our labor markets, the way that we manage prices. All of these things require significant change in order for Sri Lanka to really go to the next level as an economy. A crisis of this nature could really be the opportunity that will enable all parties to come together and move forward in a very drastic reform agenda, which is really what the country will probably need from a long-term perspective.
Thank you, Dasha, for highlighting the importance of reform in terms of the economic crisis we're in at the moment. Moving on to Professor Buchheit. Professor, as someone who has been dealing with debt restructuring for over 40 years, how do you view Sri Lanka's problem of debt? Do you think Sri Lanka's debt is sustainable or unsustainable? And how much of it do you think can be attributed to the COVID-19 pandemic? And most importantly, Professor, what advice would you give to a country facing balance of payment problems and a debt crisis simultaneously?
Thank you. The position Sri Lanka is in is not unique. Many countries have been in this position before. The country has lost access to the private capital markets. It is therefore pursuing a policy of looking to its bilateral partners to try to provide the funding that will allow it to get over what it hopes is a difficult period. Politicians in this situation, in my experience, suddenly develop a profound belief in the efficacy of prayer. They hope that inflows from bilateral partners, or in some cases multilateral partners, will be sufficient to tide the country over during the period when the country implements a homegrown fiscal adjustment program. Now, sometimes that works. Often it does not work. Fiscal adjustment programs, as my colleague on the panel just said, are inherently distasteful. Whether they are homegrown or recommended, quote unquote, by the International Monetary Fund, they will involve a degree of pain. And they would require, for example, the stripping off of subsidies on various commodities that may have become quite embedded in the economy. Homegrown adjustment programs of that kind often become casualties of the political process. Politicians simply will not have the stamina to push them through to their eventual success. It is often the case that local politicians find the intervention of someone like the IMF quite helpful, because they can say, we, your elected leaders, are not the authors of your misery. That is being prescribed by this multilateral institution. To be sure, we are a member of that institution, but we are in effect taking the doctor's medicine, but we are not prescribing it ourselves. In many cases, politicians find that quite a useful position to be in. The issue, it seems to me, for Sri Lanka comes down to this. Is there a plausible set of fiscal adjustment measures that you folks could implement in a reasonable time period, the next 2 or 3 years, which would return the country to voluntary market access, private capital market access? If there is such a set of policies, and if you think you have the stamina to push them through, then perhaps it makes sense to try to bridge this difficult period through borrowings from your bilateral partners. One final comment. The country's existing creditors will view your actions now with a degree of suspicion. Any new lender, whether private or bilateral, is of course lending into an obviously distressed situation. They will expect, therefore, that their new loans into a distressed situation will be regarded as senior to existing legacy exposure. And therefore, existing creditors may view these new credit facilities as effectively subordinating them. Perhaps not at law. Perhaps no one is going to say in the contracts this debt is senior to all pre-existing debt, but in a practical sense, the question will worry existing creditors whether this policy effectively subordinates them to the new lending. I'll stop there, Madam Chairman.
Apologies. My next question goes to Ms. Kasuri Wilson. Just a few days ago, you spoke to the Daily Financial Times and you acknowledged that the business of supplying essential medicines and consumer goods are under severe distress due to the inability to secure foreign currency for much needed input material for the manufacturing process. Given this context, Ms. Wilson, how do you think the rest of the year would turn out for business operations? What's your take on that?
Thanks, Atil. So, yeah, so being a responsible corporate, we are bound to ensure that the citizens have access to essential medicines and the consumer goods, right? And we've been facing immense challenges, not only us, I think everybody who's in the domestic market who are trying to keep the economy going. Challenges in accessing foreign currency, given the fact that we've got limited reserves. Secondly, even once you open an LC, even to discharge and honor it, it's been dishonored. Thirdly, given the global context of challenges in supply chain and the global challenges. We've been battling that in terms of access of supplies, logistics issues, and then the global commodity prices. Now, in this context, we've been really struggling, and I think the outlook and what we would expect is, I'm listening to them, and I think you have choices. You know you have a huge debt obligation which is there for the next couple of years. We can't run away from that fact. I think what we need to understand is how are we going to approach it. Again, and this debt has not been overnight, it has been there successively through mismanaged economic policy. How are we going to manage it? Is it a restructure? Are we open to even talk about it? Or is it going to be temporary, you do bilaterals to support us, but like Professor said and what like Desha said, it is going to be a lot of discipline to be able to stomach the reforms we need to do. But honestly, I feel next year is going to be challenging, absolutely challenging for all of us as a country, as corporates, as citizens. We can't shy away from that. And I think factually, as long as we can accept it, the country, the people would be behind the government if they do tell us what's going to happen. So they need to make a choice, and after that we need to understand with clarity how we move forward. Because on this side, the corporates we are talking to suppliers, we are renegotiating, we are giving them transparency in terms of as much as the information we have about certain, if LCs are not honored, we need to extend, we need to give them comfort that we are here for the long run and things would solve. But when we don't understand how it's going to be solved, we can't just blindly, and especially I don't blindly tell commitments which you can't keep. So that is the bigger issue we need to solve for us for the next year if you are going to operate as a corporate. And of course, secondly, as a country is revenues. How do you get your foreign revenues? I mean, while we have a deficit, like I think it's about $4 billion, but this year it's going to be more because remittances are down, tourism is down, right? And attracting it, if we are not in favor of devaluation, find instruments to attract it, incentives which work for the exporters and the worker remittances to come in. That's important, and I think given the challenges of what we're going through, I feel having price controls on essentials like medicines, it's absolutely unwise. I think the finance minister was he preempted and removed price controls from milk powder and stuff which were essentials, and that worked. It at least gave the businesses to be able to import it without incurring losses as such. But here in the context of access to foreign currency, B, the cost of the currency you buy, you have varied rates, you have charges added onto it, then you have input costs which have gone up, and then you talk about price control. And we don't have a mechanism. And that's leading to what you're seeing as shortages now, because at some point you don't have clarity in what you're going to import and supply. So it's going to be challenging next year. But look, I think we've all been through challenges. We are all Sri Lankans. I'm not an economist, but I'm an optimistic person. So I think as long as we have clarity of how we're going to recover, there should be a plan. It's their choice. Get the experts in and explain it to us, and then we back them. But going here with this uncertain thing of doing a plaster, short-term, very tactical stuff is not going to work at this point. We've come to a point we need structured long-term plans here.
Wilson, for highlighting the need for a concrete plan for economic recovery. Moving on to Professor Karunaratne. So there's a lot of conversation on the repayment of the international bond of $500 million next week on the 18th of January. Do you think the government should keep up with its plan and settle this ISB? And also, I think we are speaking of this in the context of Standard & Poor downgrading Sri Lanka further to a CCC rating. What is the government's take on all of this?
Actually, I'm not representing government, but as a free economist, I will discuss. Because the one thing that there are, I think, things we have to do short term, medium term, and long term. Of course, long term issues are the biggest things in Sri Lanka. Short term, maybe there was one factor which was not analyzed in our discussion. That was due to the COVID situation. People had predictions that there might be a shortage of goods. So therefore, import bill has doubled. Because during the 2020 and 2020, year 2020, you can see the entire import expenditure, which is equivalent to first half of the 2021 import bill. So the prediction was that people always expected a shortage in rice, shortage in dal, shortage in petrol. So people went into illusion, kept the much quantity. It's kind of a associated thing with the long-term phenomenon. It's not a short-term phenomenon. We try to understand these measures as short-term. So therefore, as I explained from the very beginning, my understanding is it should be a very broader policy package rather than, of course, we need to go for debt negotiation, but it not be only IMF, but with all other multilateral and bilateral donors, we have to go for negotiation. That is there, that's always there. But meanwhile, I think keeping house in order is not the thing we are doing today, and even that has not been doing. So we need to keep our house in order. As I pointed out, even if we take another loan, if we are running large loss-making public sector organizations, so what we are doing? So it's a separate issue. So my reading on the economy is too broad. We cannot, actually economics is not only figures in this year, figures in our hand, and that should integrate the entire determinants and variables to our analysis. So that is what my answer.
Thank you very much, Professor. I'd like to direct the same question to you, Dashal. Do you think it's prudent to make this payment on the 18th of January? Also, could you shed some light on whether Sri Lanka is experiencing negative impacts of MMT at the moment?
Got it. So I think given the significant pain that we've had to impose on the domestic economy in our efforts to settle all of our liabilities, I think the prudent option that the government needs to take is to enter into negotiations with creditors as soon as possible, with a view to restructuring our liabilities going forward. And part of that could be, of course, the standstill on the $500 million January payment as well. But really the important thing here is that right now, the two options that I spoke about earlier, right now, by continuing to settle creditors in full, we are imposing significant pain on the domestic economy, and that will have to just keep increasing. And it doesn't end this year, right? Next year also we have another $4 to $5 billion of payments, and the year after that as well. So we do need to find a sustainable solution to the challenges, to the external debt challenges that we have, and that would of course require some kind of restructuring, right? So I think that is, and it should be preemptive. It should be a preemptive debt restructuring where you have negotiations with creditors to do so. Again, that doesn't come without costs, it doesn't come without risks, but of the options that we have at hand, I would think that is the more prudent option that Sri Lanka faces before it right now. In terms of the second question as to whether Sri Lanka is facing the adverse impacts of MMT. So Sri Lanka has, what we're seeing right now in the domestic economy, we've seen inflation going up to double-digit levels at the end of 2021. We've seen significant pressure on the balance of payments. The current account deficit widened quite significantly last year in 2021 as well. Now, there are a multitude of factors that affect this, right? So there are, of course, the global supply chain issues, the bottlenecks that have impacted the price of goods across the board, from fuel to milk powder. Globally, those things have increased. Sri Lanka's context, those those escalations have been exacerbated given the fact that we have these forex shortages as well. Professor also mentioned earlier that it was many countries that looked at expansionary monetary policy in the form of deficit financing, expansionary fiscal policy as well, and that was the correct approach in response to the pandemic-induced recessions that Sri Lanka faced along with many other countries globally. The key is to be able to have an exit strategy from that stimulus, right? So whether it's monetary policy stimulus through deficit financing, whether it's fiscal policy stimulus, when the economy starts to recover, you need to have a way of tapering that off. Sri Lanka, I think, was probably a little bit late in terms of tapering off, particularly the monetary policy stimulus, and that would have no doubt contributed to the expansions that we are seeing in the current account deficit, the acceleration in the prices that we are seeing as well. But now it is evident that there is an attempt to taper off that stimulus. Interest rates have gone up by about 300 basis points in the fourth quarter of last year. There has been some attempted fiscal adjustment also. But I think there's a lot more that needs to be done. There's a lot more that needs to be done in terms of monetary adjustment, in terms of fiscal adjustment, to really bring some balance back into the overall macroeconomic situation.
Moving on to Professor Buchheit once again. Professor, there's a debate in Sri Lanka about how the government should approach this debt crisis that we're in at the moment. Some economists have advocated defaulting on its loans and speaking to bondholders. Others claim that a default at this juncture would have quite severe consequences. My question to you, Professor, is what exactly are the perils of default in your opinion, and how long does it take to renegotiate debt with holders of a particular bond?
I don't think there would be a renegotiation with the holders of a particular bond. All creditors, both commercial and bilateral, view each other with suspicion. So if one went to the holders, let's say, of the January 2022 bond or the July 2022 bond and said, look, you're the problem, let's restructure your liability, they would say, wait a minute, this pain must be shared with our fellow creditors, both bondholders and bilaterals. Therefore, I think if one were to embark on a debt restructuring in Sri Lanka, it would be much broader gauged. It would probably involve both bilateral creditors and commercial creditors. It might be possible, I stress the word might, to say to the commercial creditors, we have a short-term problem. We're going to look to restructure liabilities coming due in the next 2 or 3 years. But again, in my experience, the holders of those liabilities would expect that pain to be shared in an equitable fashion with all holders, excluding for this purpose the multilaterals, the IMF, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank. Those are conventionally exempted from a sovereign debt restructuring. Now you say, how long would it take? It can take as little as a year, but it can take much longer. It will depend on how efficiently the government wants to press the process. Sri Lanka has both significant bilateral and commercial creditors. It would probably approach its bilateral creditors first, and the debt relief that it obtains from those creditors, it would then say should be matched by the commercial creditors. But look, there is no international bankruptcy code applicable to sovereigns. That's what makes sovereigns unique on the planet. Corporates and individuals all have access to an institutionalized insolvency proceedings. Sovereigns don't. They're not subject to anyone's bankruptcy codes, not their own, not anyone else's. That means, therefore, that this is an inherently messy process. And while the dozens and dozens and dozens of sovereign debt workouts that have been successfully concluded over the last 40 years provide precedents that would guide any process. In the end, you cannot command any creditor to accept a degree of debt relief. You can only persuade. And therein lies the challenge. But my guess is if it were to be attempted, it would have to be a contribution sought from all of the creditors, both bilateral and commercial. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Professor. My next question goes to Ms. Wilson. As you've been stating throughout this conversation, you have had to face quite challenging issues, severe foreign exchange crisis as a head of, in the corporate world. You've had to face a severe foreign exchange crisis, an exchange rate that doesn't reflect the market rate, price controls, as you stated, and you even have had to manage and retain employees, and they're even looking to their living conditions under such unprecedented times. Even you spoke about how opening an LC is rather difficult as of now. What are your expectations of the government in terms of policy, Ms. Wilson, to kind of rectify this trajectory the country's on?
I think, yeah, you're right. I mean, all corporates are going through challenges, right? And people don't understand is you've gone through the COVID challenge, keeping the businesses running, and when you're in healthcare, you don't have a choice. You have to be out there risking everything. In spite of it, we've come up with these challenges which are which are not within our control. We need government to take a stance. So, well, I wouldn't advocate solutions. I'm not an economist, but what we would need is some kind of choice or a decision made in how they're approaching the debt crisis. Either ways, whether you are, whichever ways, right? They have to take that. Secondly, I think what is needed the hour is you need to have, whether it's homegrown domestic reforms or whether it is agency recommended reforms, we need to actually, we cannot push that down the road anymore. We need to bite it, and it is not an easy solution. Reform is an easy one word. But it's a lot. It's from fiscal monetary, it's from public sector, it's even how we have engaged with private sector and also the impact of the common man on when you go through this. We need to have a solution, and that solution is not subsidies, and the solution is not going to be embedded within the reform. It might be a social obligation on all of us to be doing the right thing by the people. But that's a solution. But firstly, you have to do what's right here. So that, I think, is firstly, we need to sort that out for us to be able to get confidence back again from our global communities who are watching us closely. Because remember, we are also obligated, it trickles down to have engagement. And either ways, they are watching us to see what direction we are going. And in that context, whatever we decide and whatever we start implementing would mean whether we can pick up, we could be able to get the capital market confidence back in, whether you get our commercial global players confidence back in, and eventually whether you have the ability to attract FDI back again. We've got an amazing country. I'm sad that politically we've divided it so much, and we don't have the willpower to do what's right economically. Because I think we are all part of it. When they say politically, I think we blindly go from party versus what's right for the country. If we don't, and I'm glad that I see Rasika and Milinda together. I mean, this is like hope, right? Next gen. So if we can do it now, and I think if you don't do it now, you're not going to be having another chance to actually say, let's move forward. So that's what we would look for, because these challenges are not going to go away, and the pain of inflation, pain of the access to foreign currency, it's not going to go away overnight. But as long as we know we are going to go step by step, we're going to solve this. And currency, access to currency or having a reserve at the moment is very important in terms of being able to bring in essentials in. And people, that's important. So, yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson, for highlighting the complexity of reform. I'd like to pose the same question to Professor Karunaratne. I think what Ms. Wilson is trying to say is that what businesses are looking for at the moment is consistency and predictability. Professor, what can be done in the sphere of policy to ensure this for businesses moving forward in the year 2022?
Yeah, actually, my understanding is that we need to take decisions based on the information and rationality, because we take the decisions of the information and of the rationality. That's the main problem we need to understand. So therefore, that we believe that monetary and fiscal policies will work, but particularly in a crisis situation, more than monetary and fiscal policy, I hope the supply side policies are very important. So if we are reducing local production day by day, if we are reducing use of local resources day by day, we are importing more and more. So then how can we face this financial crisis or foreign debt crisis in future? So I think during last 2 years, you would have seen the issue is that we understood very carefully that how excessively we depend on gas. Now, country like Sri Lanka, we know we would have opportunity to go for solar system from long ago, but you can remember in 2016 budget gave the lot of tax cut for solar, the energy-based, electricity-based vehicles. But again, 2017, we replaced again, and we put high tax on the electricity use vehicles. So what we can understand, our policies are not consistent, and we are not trying to use our resources more and more. I think average income holder can go for solar system easily in Sri Lanka, but still we are expanding more and more gas and gas turbine usage for even electricity generation. So when we think like that, how can we run organizations when we are using more and more imported raw materials in a crisis like this? So therefore, we need to think about the more and more supply side policies, the local resource oriented policies and development, and even for foreign investment. I think the Rasika and Melinda, first two of you should agree what will be the future foreign investment policy. Because when one party is inviting foreign investment, other party is saying that the country is selling, right? That has been happening for a longer period. So all the political parties should agree on the foreign investment policy in Sri Lanka. Do we have a foreign investment policy? Sometimes we invite foreign investors saying that you can buy Sri Lankan lands. Then again we say, no, 100% tax will be charged. Then again we say, no, we will never give Sri Lankan lands for foreign investors. Then what is our policy? So I do not think that the political parties are handling these issues very well. So we need to have clear policies on foreign investment, or even if we are trying to invite the foreigners, our in-house cleaning is very important.
Thank you very much, Professor. My next question goes to Dashal. Dashal, there's a charge that economists were rather silent when the debt was building up. Do you think this is a fair assessment? And I would also like to ask you what an ideal roadmap to recovery would look like to you.
I think a lot of economists and other professionals have been concerned about the increase in debt over many years. And this has been it's not been something that has come out, in a couple of years or in a couple of months. It has obviously increased significantly the last 2 years related to the pandemic, like what we have seen overseas as well. But I think there's been concern about the growth in debt and the fiscal policies that have kind of contributed to that, right? So the Sri Lanka's issue is that we've had consistent consistently high budget deficits, largely driven by weak or weakening government revenue over a couple of decades, and that has obviously cascaded over the years, and so to the extent that today interest cost accounts for about 70% of government revenue. So the fiscal space that is available to spend on necessary investments, and there are areas where the government does need to spend on areas like public transportation, health, education, effective social safety nets. All of those require actually additional spending, but our weakness has really been on the revenue side, right? So there needs to be a concerted effort to address the fiscal deficit and the way that has contributed to debt overall. And I think this has been something that has been within the Sri Lankan psyche. There's been cognizance of this for a while, but really the very dramatic turn of events that we've seen in recent times, and the real implications that we're seeing on the real economy, I think that is something that is relatively new in terms of the understanding. Sri Lanka hasn't been through, so if you actually look at it from a contextual perspective, Sri Lanka has actually only started to repay commercial debt in the last 3 years. So we talk about the fact that we have been current on all of our debt repayments. It was only from around 2019 that we actually started to repay commercial borrowings that we've had, that we've been accumulating since around 2007, right? So that is where the challenges come in. Until 2006, Sri Lanka was able to borrow from concessional financing. Managing that was very easy. You have about $500 million payments per year. Now we are seeing payments of about $4 to $5 billion per year, right? So it's like the credit card bill has finally come, and the challenges are relatively new. So that in that sense, there is a degree of novelty to the challenges that we are facing. In terms of a kind of ideal mix of reforms, let me mention three. The first one relates entirely to fiscal, right? So I would say the fundamental source of Sri Lanka's macroeconomic instability has been fiscal weakness over many decades, and that stems primarily from revenue collection. We are at about 9% of government revenue as a percentage of GDP. That's one of the lowest globally. That needs to increase quite significantly in order to bring the budget deficit to a more manageable, sustainable level. So fundamentally, addressing public finances and the fiscal deficit is a key reform that's required. Moving on from that, I think on the external sector as well, Sri Lanka needs significant. So effectively, economic growth really requires an improvement in competitiveness, right? So a lot of competitiveness can be driven through trade reform. So whether that is in terms of addressing the cascading high levels of border taxes that we face, particularly on raw materials and inputs, the impact that has on sectors like construction, on sectors like tourism, that needs to be addressed. And parallel to that, we also need to look at, on the export side, how we can tap into greater global value chains, regional value chains more effectively. Trade agreements, of course, play an important role in that equation as well, whilst making sure we address the supply side of that equation also. And then third, final point would be in terms of how we address social welfare. So today, we have relied a lot on price controls, which are very damaging in terms of resulting in shortages, resulting in quality issues, and a number of other factors, financial issues for suppliers as well. It's very encouraging to see some degree of shifting away from price controls in recent times, but that shift needs to be a more permanent shift, so that we move to more market-oriented pricing in the economy, especially of critical commodities. Now, that has to be, of course, balanced off in terms of affordability. And the way that other countries have successfully done this is by moving into cash transfers. And that, of course, requires robust targeting mechanisms as well. So I would say those are the three kind of priority reforms that Sri Lanka would need to embark on.
Thank you very much, Dashal. I'd like to turn my attention to Professor Buchheit once again. Professor, could you give us a little insight into whether it is possible to restructure debt without the involvement of the IMF? And will excluding IMF from debt restructuring negotiations ease the burden on the general public in terms of fiscal adjustments? What is your take on that, Professor?
Is it possible? Yes. A number of countries have embarked on debt restructurings without an IMF program. But is the involvement of the IMF useful? Yes, very. Traditionally, the OECD countries, the so-called Paris Club countries that restructure their debt jointly, they will insist that the IMF be involved and that the country have a program before they'll agree to a restructuring. But more broadly, commercial creditors caught up in these affairs quite understandably ask themselves, is a debt restructuring necessary? And are the terms being proposed to us for that debt restructuring proportional to what the country actually needs? Not perhaps what it wants, but what it actually needs. How are they to satisfy themselves as to those two questions? They won't have access to all the information that the IMF receives, for example. Moreover, they won't trust the debtor country itself to reach those conclusions. They will look for a third party that has the information and has the expertise to vouchsafe the answers to those two questions. Yes, that a debt restructuring is necessary, which is simply another way of saying that there are no plausible set of fiscal policies that the country could implement on its own, which would avoid the crisis. And second, that the terms of the debt restructuring are proportional to what the country needs. And this is not simply arithmetic. What the IMF does when it comes in and does a so-called debt sustainability analysis, it must look at the effects of its policies on the country's economy as a whole, but with particular concern for the poorer segments of the economy. It is to some degree economics. It is to some degree simple morality. And to have the IMF involved allows the debtor country to assuage these concerns of its creditors that what they're being asked to do is what is proportional. Look, and I'll end with this, every sovereign debt restructuring, every one of them, comes down to one basic burden-sharing decision. How much of the pain of the country's adjustment should be borne by the citizens of the country in the form of fiscal adjustment, higher taxes, lower subsidies, lower public workforce, all of that. How much of the pain should be borne by the citizens and how much by the creditors in the form of debt relief? The only institution on the planet that purports to have both the technical expertise to make that burden-sharing judgment and the political legitimacy to do so is the International Monetary Fund. I know they are not persona grata in every country. They know it too. But the reality is that that is the balance, that is the judgment. And each side, both the citizens and the creditors, will worry that they are being asked to bear a disproportionate share of the burden of the adjustment, and they will look to a neutral third party to confirm that that is not the case. I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Professor. That was very insightful. Moving on to Ms. Wilson. I think throughout the conversation what we see is that every crisis presents an opportunity. And we also spoke about the importance of market-oriented policy reforms like prioritizing supply, demand, and price mechanisms. Do you think that this is the opportunity that lies ahead for us? What is your view on this? Do you think this is an opportunity to understand the importance of these policies and embark on them as soon as possible?
I think the opportunity is, while it's an opportunity to embark on policies, I think it's an opportunity where you can get, the government has a great platform to get everybody onto one side and one table and to go behind one cause. So it's the government, it's the opposition, it's the public sector, it's the private sector, and it's the people. If you don't get them all on the same page and towards one agenda, you're not going to get it right. Because you heard Professor saying this. It's going to be a balance as to who bears the bigger burden. And that is a huge pill politically to swallow. If you don't get everybody together. As a country, if we want to leave something back for our children to live in and not leave so much of struggles for them, I think it's the time we get everybody together. There are economists on the government side and the opposition side. Get everybody in together and get the people together. Let's stick to a plan. Let's sign a mandate. Whoever stays in power or leaves, whoever comes in power or doesn't come in power, this gets executed. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be easy for public sector either. But they are people of the country. They are not eliminated from, and we as corporates are also people of the country. So eventually we are all citizens. Like I tell the company, people make the company. And we need to understand who has which strength, and eventually it's one company agenda, this same thing. So that's the opportunity I think we have here. And it's a unique opportunity because all of us understand this situation is not going to be an easy situation to solve. It's not going to go away overnight because we managed to get some relief. It's whether we address it today or in 6 months, the problem is going to come in. So I would think that's the single biggest opportunity here.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wilson. I think we've come to the concluding minutes of our discussion. We have a few questions coming in from our online audience. I think this is directed at both Deshal and Professor Lee. The question is, how do you see rating downgrades by S&P and even Fitch? Your take on sovereign downgrades?
Well, if you look at Sri Lanka's trajectory of rating actions over the last couple of years, we've seen it's related to two main factors. The first has been with regard to, again, fiscal weakness, right? So a couple of times in last year as well as this year, soon after the budget, we saw rating action by Fitch. Just prior to the budget, we saw rating action by Moody's. And again, this year as well, S&P has come in. So certainly the difficulties or the inability to project a credible fiscal path that can strike the required adjustments in terms of from a fiscal side to address the debt issues. That is certainly one factor that rating agencies have been keeping a close eye on. And the second is, of course, the reserve position. So rating agencies will also consider whether we have the reserve cushion to be able to meet the upcoming liabilities as well. So again, we know that Sri Lanka's reserves have been eroding in the last couple of years. So that's been a second factor that has caused the ratings to diminish in the last in recent times. So I am personally not surprised at the trajectory of the ratings, given the directions on the fiscal side and the directions on the reserve side. So really, the sustainable path out of this crisis is for Sri Lanka to find a way to build up reserves and to enhance its credit ratings, right? So for that, the first step is to adjust the fiscal trajectory. We need to get back onto a fiscal path that is sustainable and credible in the medium term. That will help us build up our ratings to some extent. That will in turn help us build up our reserves and be able to then to re-access global capital markets. Once we can access capital markets, then you can start refinancing your maturing liabilities, and then keep reserves stable, and then be able to have the reserves requirement for the normal functioning of the economy as well. So I would think that is the way to kind of get out of the difficulties that we are facing right now, but that requires time, right? You can't make those adjustments on the fiscal side immediately. You can't make those adjustments that will provide confidence to rating agencies globally within a couple of months, right? So that is where I feel that negotiation with creditors is important to come into a restructuring agreement, so that we buy some time, so that we buy some space to be able to take these necessary reforms and then get back onto a more sustainable trajectory.
Thank you very much, Deshal. Professor Lee, this same question was directed to you as well. What is your take on rating downgrades on Sri Lanka? This was one of the questions that were directed at us from one of our online viewers.
I would not worry very much about rating downgrades. Look, they are relevant only if you were intending to reaccess the market in the next year or so. They simply reflect the rating agency's perception of the likelihood of a default over a certain time period. But the way this works is when a country announces the need to pursue a debt restructuring, the rating agencies will typically take the country to what they call selective default. That will be the rating until the debt restructuring is concluded. And the rating agencies in recent years have been very good. Once a debt restructuring is completed, of lifting the country back into a much higher rating category. Again, it is in practical terms, in my view, irrelevant unless you think you're going to be issuing securities which will be priced off of that rating. And you're not in that position. Sri Lankan bonds maturing more than a year out are trading at 48, 50 cents on the dollar. You're not in a position, I think, to be issuing additional what you call ISBs in the near future, and therefore rating downgrades, to my mind, have little practical effect.
Thank you very much, Professor. One last question from the audience, and I'd like to direct it to Professor Karunaratne. The question in broader terms is, what can be done to improve Sri Lanka's investment climate?
Yeah, there are many things to do that. First and most important thing, as I pointed out at the very beginning, we have to have informations regarding the economy. Even fiscal adjustments we can't do without having information, because if you take the revenue of Sri Lanka, 80% coming from the taxes on goods and services, 20% from the people, that tax net is not effective in Sri Lanka because there is no good database. There are many people, they have to pay taxes, they are not paying in this country because of the information gap. And particularly with respect to Sri Lankan climate, we do not have, in economic climate I am referring, grassroots level information. We don't have Grama Sevaka level, the Grama Niladhari level, the grassroots level information, who rich, who are poor. And on the other hand, fiscal reform, we don't talk much on the expenditure. Every year, public servant salary, whether they go on strike or not, we are increasing 10,000, 5,000, 15,000. So how can we go like this in a country? What kind of fiscal adjustments we can do when we consider the revenue side, when we consider the expenditure side? If you take the revenue side, are we going to increase the taxes on goods and services, which represents the 80% of taxes? Are we going to increase the personal taxes, which is 20% of taxes? Of course, we can do that if we reform the tax net in Sri Lanka, information in Sri Lanka. Those who are not paying taxes, they have to pay the taxes. Until we search those issues, we cannot reform our taxation. Just increasing income tax rate, you know, the earlier government, they had this issue. Just increasing the income tax rate for public servants or those who are getting over 100,000, that is not the solution for tax revenue. So the issue is that information collection at grassroots level. On the other hand, we have to have agreement, all the political parties, as she also pointed out, that what we are going to do. We need an economic planning agency, like in Japan. If you go to Japan, I have been in 13 years in Japan, that's why I take a lot of experience. They have an economic planning agency. They understand the economy, they read the economy, they design the policies. Then whatever the political party come into the power, they have to follow those policies. Up to that level, I think we are always trying to go in bad way. We need to have professional economic planning with the information and knowing the information. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. Even though this is a topic that can be discussed extensively, I think we've come to the conclusion of our session today. Thank you very much for joining in with us, both here physically and online. I'd like to thank Professor Lee for joining in with us, Professor Karunaratna, Ms. Wilson, and Mr. Dimel. Thank you very much for being here today. We hope that this discussion answered at least some of the questions that you may have had in terms of Sri Lanka's economic trajectory. We hope to meet you soon with a similar discussion in the near future. Thank you very much and have a good night.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you all agree that that was a very thought-provoking discussion on Sri Lanka Economic Outlook for 2022. And our panelists have indeed helped to educate us with their extremely thought-provoking remarks and perspectives. We offer all of our panelists our heartfelt gratitude for adding value to the gathering here this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, we're almost coming to the tail end of this program, but before we wrap up, let's take an opportunity to remember that the event today would not be possible without the energy, the effort, the time, the talent of so many contributors, and therefore we would now like to thank each of these contributors in a formal vote of thanks. To now do the honors of summing up our appreciation in the vote of thanks, I'd like to invite the co-convener NextGen Sri Lanka. Let's put our hands together for Milinda Rajapaksa.
This is the end of the movie advertisement. Thank you very much, Rasika, for letting me to give the vote of thanks on behalf of NextGenSL. In politics, you don't give the mic to opponent generally, but since the discussion is on economics, probably Rasika wanted me to give the vote of thanks since I am representing the team which is having a difficult time. So we initiated NextGenSL almost 4 or 5 years ago when we were having the 52 days of government. Rasika and I must remember Eranga from JVP. He's leading the JVP Youth Front. 3 of us together started this movement. And Eranga is now actually doing a fantastic job against the government. Probably that is why he couldn't attend today. We initiated this movement, NextGenSL. It is a cross-party youth movement. So all the political parties which represent the parliament, their youth wings represent the NextGenSL. So we wanted to debate in public. That is why we initiated NextGenSL. So earlier what we did was we debated on politically important topics in public. We did a massive debate at Vihara Mahadevi Park, at Idea Hill, and many other places. We have organized almost 15 public debates in front of different gatherings. We have debated on our policies, our ideologies, to defend our political camps during the elections. Most importantly, we have debated on about our dreams. And one thing we all have realized, not only Rasika and myself, but everyone doing politics as young people, that we all are sharing a very common dream. You know, to have a better country, to have a better future, to build a better a place for all of us. So we all have been sharing the same dream, but politically we stand in a very different way, because the way we want to achieve that dream is different. We believe different paths, hence we debate. So thank you very much, Friedrich Naumann Foundation, for agreeing to the food and drinks menu we suggested. And your wonderful support even for the pre-budget discussion. This is the second part we did. Without your kind support, this would have not been possible. Thank you very much for the team at Naumann Foundation. Then thank you very much, Professor Lee. Actually, almost 1,000 people have been watching this online via different platforms on Facebook, today's discussion. We are actually honored to have you, Professor Lee, with us today. And Kasuri, thank you very much. You have been a very genuine supporter of NextGenSL for a long time. You attended our International Women's Day event too. Thank you very much for being here today. Even though you are coming from the airport, made it on time. Thank you very much for that. And Professor Karunaratne, congratulations. Probably this is your first event as the Vice Chancellor. See, that's how we do it. Thank you very much. I know you have a lot of work, but making it to here, and I know it's a difficult seat to debate on behalf of the government, to defend the government's position. Thank you very much for being here. And Deshal, thank you very much. You are representing our generation too. Thank you very much for being here and showing your very strong position and the argument. Thank you very much, Satya, and thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming here. It's a very short notice. We took only 4 or 5 days to organize the whole thing, so thank you very much, everyone, for coming and supporting the political cause we all have been fighting for in different ways. So thank you very much for the hotel staff, for the wonderful service and Pulse, then the digital team here, giving this on Facebook Live. A lot of people are watching it on Facebook, and everyone else. Thank you very much. Have a good evening. We have good drinks and good food. Enjoy the evening.
Well, thank you very much, Melinda, for those very warm words of gratitude expressed to everybody involved in bringing this forum to life. On that note, ladies and gentlemen, I do trust that as we come to the end of our conversation here today, that this discussion has opened our eyes to the possibilities that could lie for Sri Lanka's economy. So we hope and trust that the future brings with it robust, sustainable, and inclusive national growth so that it ushers in prosperity and a better life for all Sri Lankans. With that, we now draw the curtains to our discussion here on Sri Lanka Economic Outlook 2022, organized for you by NextGen Sri Lanka in partnership with the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom. Of course, it's our pleasure now to invite you to please join us for dinner and fellowship. And with that, thank you for your participation. I wish you a pleasant evening ahead. Have a nice day.